Welcome back, everybody, to the 360 Size Up podcast, where this is our third podcast on the OSHA 1910-156 proposed changes, and we just wanted to give everybody an update on what happened this week. And our two guests that we've got, you've heard them before, Chief Tobia, Ken LaSala. They participated this week with the hearing. And just wanted to get some feedback and kind of get to see which direction we're going and where we stand after this week. Chief, and I'll start out with you, Chief, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, Dan. As always, thanks so much for giving us an opportunity to continue to talk about this very important subject. You know, your this podcast and your continued willingness to give people factual information about an important topic is just really deeply appreciated. So I just want to say thanks first.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to be with you. I know Ken and I appreciate the chance to share information. So this week was a very exciting week in the continued process of rulemaking. As you know, we're talking about the emergency response standard. This is OSHA's effort to, for the very first time in 40 years, establish new standards and regulations around ensuring safety for emergency response personnel. This does represent a dramatic change because the only thing that's been in existence is the 1980 version of the 1910.156 standard on fire brigades. And this does represent a dramatic departure from the past. As you know, OSHA released draft rules in February. They entertained written comments in answer to a series of questions up until July. That was originally supposed to end in May, and then they extended it to June, and then finally extended it into July. The IAFC put together a group of over 30 representatives from all segments of the IAFC, including federal and military, wildland policy, metropolitan section, volunteer and combination section, and then all of the disciplines within the IAFC to provide subject matter expertise to the written comments that were submitted. Those were facilitated by a law firm that helped us assemble our comments into 33 pages of written comments. Really very comprehensive effort, very transparent effort, and very inclusive effort to ensure that all segments of the IAFC were heard in those written comments. Thereafter, OSHA put out a notice of intent to hold public testimony. We, the IAFC, timely filed a request to provide public comments around this new proposed rulemaking, and we were invited to participate. Day one of that public testimony occurred on Tuesday, November 12th. Public testimony initiated with representatives from the International Association of Firefighters, followed by the International Association of Fire Chiefs, followed by the National Volunteer Fire Council. And those three entities rounded out the entire first day of public comment. The public comment process is actually really interesting, Chief. It's actually overseen by an administrative law judge. And in this case, the senior law judge, Judge Hensley, for OSHA and the Department of Labor, is serving as the hearing officer for this process. Now, the role of the administrative law judge is to ensure that the procedures for public hearing are followed closely by the participants, and they are meant to serve as a really just an individual designed to keep us within the guardrails of the process, if you will. It's not as formal as a court hearing, meaning there are not specifically rules of evidence. There is not a formal cross-examination of witnesses, if you will, and people are not actually sworn in for the hearing. But they are designated to be able to represent the agencies. And of course, that's all a process that occurs in advance. Numerous representatives of OSHA staff receive the information that is offered during public comment because it is that group that is charged with reviewing and potentially revising the draft rules for the process. So it is a very formal process, but it is not as formal as someone might experience if they were in a criminal court hearing or even a civil court hearing. And Ken, have I missed any part? Is there anything else that you think we should mention about that process?
Just two quick things, Chief. First of all, we'd also like to mention that the industrial fire section was involved. They played a huge role in helping us put together our comments. We're very grateful for their input. And then second, the other thing just which was a little different than maybe what we would expect, is that the other speakers could actually quiz each other. So, for example, after Chief Tobia spoke, we had a representative both from the IFF and a representative from FASNY, from New York, actually asked up and followed questions. So that was kind of interesting, kind of an unexpected wrinkle, kept us all on our toes.
So, Chief, you represented the IFC. You were on the hearing and or at the hearing. How long were you talking? How long did they ask your questions?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Really appreciate it. So, as you recall, Chief, I was fortunate to have served on the NACOSH committee, NACOSH subcommittee that was formed in 2015 to actually draft new regulations. And then the effort on Tuesday, we asked for and were granted a 20-minute slot to provide prepared comments that summarized our 33 pages of written comments. And then we probably spent an additional 15 or 20 minutes answering questions, both from OSHA staff and from the representatives of the two public entities that asked to pose questions, which was the IAFF and the Firefighters Association of the State of New York, which is
so. Based off you being there and being asked questions and participating, what was the temperature? Are we going in the right direction? Because in our past podcast, we talked about the NACOSH and how we got to this point was saving lives and lowering injuries. Is that really where the hearing was going this week?
Yeah, I have to say that I really think that the overall temperature of the groups was one of general support for reducing preventable line of duty deaths and injuries. So I don't think anybody is opposed to that effort. I think that individual constituencies are obviously speaking from right. Not surprisingly, the IAFF is speaking from a labor's view. The NVFC is concerned about the impact on volunteer firefighters across our country who protect, probably 70% of the land mass of our country. And, not necessarily, certainly not, as significant a component of the population that's protected, but, small rural volunteer firefighters protecting their own communities are very invested in their own communities. And of course, the NVFC is mindful of that, right? The NFPA, I think, is concerned about how the OSHA might envision using their standards. And there's been, I think there's ongoing discussion about that. But I will tell you that my read on the experience was, number one, it was very cordial. Everybody was very professional towards each other, and that there was, I think, a general desire to arrive at a conclusion that does the very best for the very most without adversely impacting service delivery.
Chief?
So impacting, I want to go because my next question is about cost. We know a lot of the comments coming back was, how is this going to be funded? We can't afford this. You're adding in all these NFPA standards. Was there any focus or any discussion on that?
Yeah, I think really there was a lot of discussion around that. And importantly, that is why the IAFC has proposed a 10-year implementation. OSHA's initial draft regulations proposed a 3-year implementation in a phased approach over 3 years. We countered that proposal with a 10-year implementation. And we purposefully recommended that some of the no-cost components of the draft rules be implemented first to afford jurisdictions time to develop financial solutions to the more expensive components of the regulations. We also made OSHA very aware of some of the potential financial impacts to jurisdictions, and they were pleased to receive that information and actually asked us to share that with them as they continue their economic impact. But the main thing that the IAFC focused on was expanding the implementation timetable to 10 years to afford jurisdictions and entities the time needed to properly plan, budget, and implement the final rules.
Chief, that's one thing
Yes.
I'd like to highlight. Chief Tobia talked about it earlier. We were talking about the kind of the tenor of the meeting. I think, a lot of folks are interested in trying to help OSHA improve the standard and, from different perspectives. The IFC perspective, our members are going to be responsible for comprehending and developing policies that actually meet those standards. At the end of the day, the fire chief is accountable for meeting the standards of the OSHA standards. So what we did was we provided constructive advice on how to improve the standard from the perspective of the fire chief. Both, and this is why it's important for us to have a comprehensive feedback from everybody, from the hazmat ops chiefs to the terrorism response chiefs, to the people in charge of fire protection, safety, health, and survival, the safety officers. We really came from the perspective of, okay, if someone has to, at the end of the day, is handed this big book of OSHA regulations, and they go, okay, what do I do with this? The fire chief is going to be responsible. So we tried as much as possible to give them comments to make it easier for our members. The big thing, obviously, is extending it out for 10 years for the implementation period. And we gave them good reason. We can go into why we did that. But also, we also picked out different parts of the regulation and pointed out other parts that need to be included in this regulation, including like for volunteers. The Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division has set some guidances on volunteer compensation. And the thing we wanted to do is make sure that OSHA, as they're putting together how they define a volunteer firefighter, that they include, previous decisions by other parts of the Department of Labor. Because the one problem we run into is the federal government never talks to each other. So we just cannot have a situation where we've got the Wage and Hour Division for regulatory purposes defining volunteers one way, and then we have OSHA defining volunteers a different way. So a lot of this is, basically how do we make life easier for the fire chief when these regulations are actually promulgated, and also giving them some realistic guidance on the implementation, because it doesn't help us if they roll out like a 3-year implementation period, and a department has to go buy a new apparatus, and it's going to take them like 4 years or more to actually get the apparatus. That's putting someone in a lose situation, which is something which we don't want to have happen.
Good. So you said that you went and you discussed, or you, I guess, recommended a 10-year plan, is what you're saying. Did you have to say, we've got this plan, here's a 600-page document, or is it a recommendation that we take the time and give us 10 years to roll this out? Was that the case, or was there a lot of work done on the back end to say we have a plan?
Yeah, so what we did was we took the list of proposed, so OSHA proposed a 3-year timeline for implementing all of the various aspects of the proposed rules. For example, adopting an incident management system, having a mechanism to report safety and health concerns, retiring outdated PPE, purchasing apparatus that is compliant with applicable NFPA standards, right? So those are just examples. They had a list of probably 45 different action points that fire chiefs would need to take to become compliant with the regulation. They proposed a 3-year implementation timetable. We took those 45 items and spread them out over 10 years, some within the first 12 months, right? So, for example, we said that within the first 12 months, you should have and adopt a formal incident management system. Doesn't cost any money to do that. It's a relatively easy thing to accomplish within the first 12 months. By comparison, if the final rule includes a requirement for medical evaluations, we actually push that out to 84 months because the amount of time needed to budget, plan for, find healthcare practitioners, and implement an annual medical evaluation program would take much longer. And so annual physicals we proposed at 84 months. So those are just examples of what we took that OSHA proposed and how we edited it.
Did you get a feeling that they would remove any NFPA standards that was in the proposal, or maybe add some, or what we've got right now is what we're going forward with? It's basically a timeline.
No, I think it's pretty early to decide. I think it's premature to decide or to opine about what the final rules may look like with regard to the NFPA standards for a number of reasons. Number one, we proposed some alternative ways for OSHA to use the NFPA standards instead of incorporating them by reference. They are currently proposing to incorporate standards by reference, which takes a consensus-based document and puts it into the force of regulation, right? We proposed that OSHA could consider a number of alternative ways to still use the NFPA standards without using the IBR method. They could, for example, generally reference them. They could use them as examples of how an organization could be compliant. In other words, when they went in to do an evaluation, they could use the NFPA standards as a guideline for evaluating a jurisdiction without formally incorporating them by reference. We also recommended some very specific language around equivalency that would allow a jurisdiction to find substantially similar mechanisms for accomplishing the same thing envisioned in NFPA without adopting NFPA. So I'll give you an example. NFPA 1582 physicals, right? For some remote or frontier jurisdictions where in a frontier jurisdiction might be a population of less than 7 people per square mile, right? That may be the only way to accomplish a 1582 physical in that situation is by telehealth. Now, we proved during COVID, during the pandemic, that telehealth was a valid model for being able to deliver healthcare. And so maybe one thing that OSHA could consider would be allowing that as an equivalency to implementing a 1582 physical, right? Based on certain circumstances. So those are just examples. I just think it's really premature to talk about what the final rule might look like and how OSHA might adopt or implement or reference NFPA standards.
Some of the questions we got back from our previous podcast on this topic was, we were going into an election, new administration's going in, and I don't know if that affects this or not, but those are probably the most asked question I got after our previous podcast. And I don't know if it matters or if it does have any bearing on where we go with the proposed changes.
So I think it's important to understand what the next steps are in the process anyway, right? So first, OSHA currently is in the middle of what will end up being 4 weeks of public testimony. So this entire week, next week, they'll take the week of Thanksgiving off, and then the first 2 weeks of December, they have already scheduled full days of testimony for the next 4 weeks. Once those 4 weeks are concluded, there will be an additional period of time through January 17th for individuals who have publicly testified to give follow-up written comments on questions that they may have been asked during testimony. So, for example, we got a couple of questions that we are going to provide written comments on that are due by January 17th. I think that's the date. Don't hold me to it, but I think that's right. After that date, OSHA staff will then spend about the next year or 18 months fully reviewing and evaluating all of the written comments they received between February and July of this year, and then all of the public testimony that they received, and all of the written follow-up comments that they are going to receive through January 17th. And they'll take about a year to 18 months to evaluate all of that, consider all of that, make revisions to the proposed rule, and then contemplate what the next steps may be. Now, again, it would be, I think, premature to say what might happen in the next presidential administration. In the previous Trump administration, OSHA was required to very carefully consider new regulations juxtaposed against retiring outdated regulations. And it might be reasonable to think that that could happen again in the next Trump administration. But that is 100% speculation. Until a new Secretary of Labor is seated and confirmed, and until a new Secretary of Labor gives guidance to OSHA about what its mission is going to be for the next 4 years, any opinion is going to be strictly speculative.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that question. I don't know if our listeners would greatly appreciate that. For the next 4 weeks, how did they come up with who they're asking to give testimony? How was that vetted out?
Yeah, OSHA didn't actually ask anyone in particular. OSHA invited anyone and everyone who had a interest in this topic to request permission to be able to speak during this public hearing. Mm-hmm. And as long as an individual timely submitted their request through the Federal Register and OSHA, they were granted time. They needed to propose how much time they wanted. I would say that the overwhelming majority of individuals who are going to be speaking over the course of the next 4 weeks are going to be speaking for 5 minutes. It tends to be a very brief presentation of comments.
Okay. So as we wrap up here, where we stand today, you said we've got 4 more weeks of the hearings, and people can listen to this. They can listen to this. This is virtual, so I don't know where you can tell our listeners to.
Yeah, it's YouTube, so they can literally just go on YouTube and enter in OSHA hearing, and they can literally listen in. Now, it's important to note for your listeners, Chief, that they cannot provide comment. They can listen only on YouTube, and there is no mechanism now for individuals to provide comment if they did not sign up in advance. But they can listen, and not only can they listen live, but they can go to OSHA's website and they can hear the public testimony given on previous days. So if they want to go back and hear what the IAFC said on November 12th, they can feel free to do so.
When's the next hearing date? Do you know?
Tomorrow.
Yeah. Tomorrow.
Yep. Okay. Tomorrow is the 15th. Yep. And it's every single day during the week during business hours. So typically between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., Monday through Friday, excluding federal holidays. And I believe that OSHA has already indicated that they will not be holding hearing during the week of Thanksgiving.
Okay. All right. Is there anything for our listeners who's sitting on their hands waiting to see where the future of this proposed OSHA change may come? Is there any final comments that you want to share that you've seen this week or testified to?
Yeah, Dan, just first, I just want to say thanks again for giving us a platform to continue to keep people educated and informed about this important issue. The IAFC is very focused on making sure that the voice of the IAFC is heard. Ken LaSala is doing an amazing job of spearheading that and keeping everybody in the IAFC informed. I think it's important that people remain calm and be patient. Rulemaking is not a fast process, and it's deliberative for a reason, because they are consequential and there is potential impact. But we also know that firefighters die in ways that are preventable, and that these regulations are designed to reduce preventable line of duty deaths and injuries. And there's a lot of data around the cost avoidance associated with not having people injured and killed. And so I think it's just really important that people remain aware, they remain educated, they ask hard questions when they need to, that they come to the IAFC and ask us questions so that we can ground truth information and provide accurate information about what the future looks like around this process. But mostly people just need to stay informed and listen carefully to individuals who are truly aware of what's happening.
Well, and I greatly appreciate both of you coming on here for the third time. As this just keeps getting, as we get closer and closer, I know we'll come back when we get to another point where there's more information. But I appreciate you both being in the trenches, so to speak, and just how you summarize it. This is a, this is more about protecting lives and saving lives. So again, I appreciate the time here, and we'll be in touch here soon.
Yep.
Chief,
Ken, go ahead.
I just want to say real quick, thanks for your time. And I really appreciate your podcast, getting the information out to everybody. I think it's incredibly helpful to be able to just catch up for a few minutes with the work that you're doing, and you get the real information out there. So, thanks for all your help and time on this. And, if any questions, feel free to contact us at the IFC. Thank you.
Thank you both.